Okay, hello everyone. This is the video for the answers to the judge test for Madrid Euros 2021. I will be going through all of the different answers and questions, and if you have any questions afterwards, please do feel free to reach out. Okay, great. I think Lovro is going to get started with the first question.
Yes, we're going to do the true and false and multiple choice questions at the beginning and then the scenario ones later. Okay, so the first question is: you're chairing a debate and you disconnect for half of the DPM speech. Even if you cover that you didn't listen to the speech and ask other panelists to tell you what the DPM said, you are not able to vote in the decision. This is true, as if you miss any parts of the speeches made by teams, you simply do not have enough information, and it is not allowed for you to take part in the discussion. The second question: a panel consists of a chair, a trainee, and a panelist. If the chair disagrees with the rest of the adjudicators, the decision should lay with the chair. This is correct because trainees do not have the right to vote, meaning that it is only the chair and the panelist, and in this case, the chair has a casting vote. The third question: any argument that is offensive or constitutes an equity violation should be discounted in its entirety by that panel. Although it is very likely that the argument is going to be less persuasive if it is offensive or constitutes an equity violation, we do not discount the argument preemptively on the basis of this, but rather it is weighed as a contribution in the debate to the extent that it is persuasive still, despite being offensive or constituting an equity violation in its part or in its entirety as a whole. The fourth question: the role of the chair is to facilitate the discussion in such a way as to convince other adjudicators in the panel to adopt the chair's call. This is not correct for the reason that the role of the chair is to facilitate the discussion and to come to a correct call, which might be different than the chair's call. This is why we have panels in the end, and this is why we give the opportunity to the panel as a whole to roll the chair and to basically come to a conclusion, which is the most objective one in terms of reading of the debate. Fifthly, you are chairing a very contentious talk room in round 7. You are certain your call is correct, but the panelists disagreed, and it's taken you some time to explain your reasoning. So far, one panelist has almost agreed with you, but you believe that a few more minutes will mean you will convince them to vote with you. A runner comes into the room and asks you and lets you know 20 minutes have passed, but asks you to vote. You can overrule the runner and should be free to take extra time to reach the correct decision. This is not correct. You should, in all instances, first of all, respect runners, the organization, and the tab team. But secondly, this is an unfair benefit that you are taking in this case, because the rest of the teams and the rest of the panels have had no more than 20 minutes to reach the discussion, and it is simply inequitable to allow some of the panels to last longer and potentially have more decision time. So in the end, there is a reason why we limit the discussion to 20 minutes, because this allows the tournament to run smoothly. And if you're doing so, you are prioritizing your own call and your willingness to convince other people over the integrity and the tournament as a whole, which is a couple hundred people. Sixthly, when making a decision, judges should take into account if the teams made the arguments that they themselves would have made in the debate. This is false, as we judge the debate without any preconception of what the arguments should and will look like. So even in the case where you would have run some things differently, you should still assess the debate as it happened without any premeditation on what the argument that was made means in relation to some that you would potentially make. 7. In motions about social justice movements, any arguments about the harms of benefits to the movement/marginalized groups inherently wins over any argument about harms or benefits to the majoritarian group. This is false, as with all of the impacts in debates generally and with the contributions. they should be weighted neutrally. So even though this debate is about marginalized groups, the impacts to them cannot automatically win over the impacts to other groups, but rather it should be proven that these impacts are something which are more persuasive, make a bigger contribution to the debate, and in the end should be weighted above the impacts to other specific groups. Question number 8. If an argument is made by opening government, but afterwards the debate moves in a different direction, the opening argument has become of clash and should be less relevant to your decision. This is wrong because we do not assess the relevancy of open government according to what other teams think is relevant, but rather we as judges do have the ability to assess the contributions of opening government and the relevancy of the argument with regards to the motion. So it is entirely possible that opening government runs a case which is not responded to other teams, but still wins the debate or performs very well because the arguments made were relevant and the rest of the debate did not engage with these relevant arguments. Question number 9. Judges should discount material from a closing team that contradicts their opening, even if this is never identified as a knife by another team in the debate. This is correct, as judges have the opportunity to assess whether the material brought was knifing to their openings, even if this is not flagged by teams. This serves as a purpose or as a part of the authority by judges to assess the relevance and persuasiveness of the material, as well as to enforce the judge manual in these sort of circumstances. Of course, it is better if teams identify this, but this in no way means that judges should not do this autonomously, even without the teams identifying this. And question number 10, in close calls, when comparing teams in a diagonal, for example, opening argument and closing opposition, you can use lack of engagement by not taking any POIs to decide which team should win. This is true, and judges not only can use that, but also should use that, as POIs are an important part of the format which ensure fairness and engagement between teams, especially on diagonals, and as such are an integral part of the format and the debate and should be taken into account when making a decision on which team wins in a particular clash. Okay, and I'll head over to Jason right now.
Okay, great. So I'll be doing the next 10 questions or so. So question 11. In the top half of a debate, opening opposition clearly defeats the opening government team. However, the closing government team sufficiently rebuts all the arguments coming from opening opposition and defeats them. In the final call, opening government should be ranked ahead of the opening opposition team. This answer is false. The reason why is because you've already compared opening opposition to opening government. You've decided that opening opposition has beaten opening government. Our comparison should always be between the two teams in these circumstances, and therefore closing government's contribution here should not affect the top half call. Therefore, this answer is false. Question 12. Completely new lines of argumentation in the DLO should not be credited as the opening government team does not have a chance to respond to them. This is false. Material in the DLO is allowed to be credited. This is just in the judge manual, you can check, but that is the general rule of thumb. So if material does come out in DLO, it should be credited. 13. On the motion, this House would create a separatist state for street dogs. It is legitimate for opening opposition to propose an alternative way to use the land and resources. This answer is true. This is just using the proposition fiat in order to have a counter model or a counter prop, whatever term you want to use to describe it. This is again in the judge manual, but opposition has the right in OO to use the same amount of fiat that proposition uses in order to construct an alternative. 14. Team A makes eloquent out-of-the-box arguments, but loses against Team B, who makes more predictable arguments that win the debate. Team A can be awarded higher speaks than Team B to reward them for their more creative arguments. This is false, and there are two different reasons why this is false. First of all, generally speaking, we don't care about more creative arguments, we care about arguments that win debates. So just because an argument is creative does not necessarily mean that it is better than any other argument. The second thing that's important is that we've decided Team B beats Team A. In BP, there are no low point wins. So that means that if a team places ahead of another team, that first team, in this case, team B, ought to have higher speaks. And that just reflects the fact that they won in comparison to team A. Question 15. You are unsure who has won top half as opening government and opening opposition have not sufficiently rebutted each other's claims. Closing government speech destroys opening opposition by pointing out that it is A, less likely to happen, and B, mitigated by closing government's analysis. Given this, opening opposition's case has been inherently weakened and opening government should win top half, all other things equal. The answer here is false. The reason why is similar to the reason that I gave for an earlier question. We should be comparing opening government and opening opposition directly. You may be unsure who has won top half, but you definitely need to be looking for more metrics then in that circumstance, because bringing closing government in, again, alters that comparison in a way that is unfair and doesn't actually accurately reflect what we're trying to compare. Question 16. If the call in the debate ends up being a split decision, and the answer here is B. The speaker scores the teams compared in the split decision should be decided by the majority of the panel and the margin may be large. Just because it's a split does not necessarily mean that it is close. We might have the majority decide that it was a very clear debate. And in the same way that the majority gets to decide who ends up winning the round, they also get to decide the speaker scores. That means that if they think it was clear, that margin may indeed be large. Question 17. If the majority of the panel makes a decision that the chair does not agree with, the answer here is A. The chair can force a panelist to deliver the oral adjudication. Those in the minority obviously still have an input in voting for speaker scores, and C and D just are obviously just assumptions. This might not be true. There could be a variety of reasons why it is the chair got rolled. So the answer here is A, because in the judge manual, it does note that chairs can force panelists to deliver the OA. 18. Which of the following scenarios would result in an automatic fourth? The answer here is F, none of the above. The reason why is because all debate judging is comparative. Sure, one team might make a pretty big mistake, but other teams might make bigger mistakes. There is no such thing as an auto fourth, and we should always be comparing between the different teams and seeing how their contributions end up lining up at the end of a round. 19. As long as the speech can be followed, the style of the speaker should be evaluated in, and the answer here is D, style should not be evaluated. Style is not a metric for judging in BP, and therefore all of the other options are about how style does affect some part of the call or speaker scores are incorrect. Question 20. What material can be added in WHIP? So the correct answers here are B, C, D, E, and F. Now, the reason why is in this case, we end up having a bunch of things that are explicitly allowed in the judge manual. However, what is not allowed are new arguments. Again, the idea is the WHIP should only be deepening the analysis in the round. They shouldn't be bringing forward new analysis. And G is also incorrect because there's no ability for closing opposition to provide a counterprop that is only an opening opposition. Okay, great, go.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
No worries, just passing things off to Lovro now for the scenario questions.
Thank you, Jason. So the first question that we have is, the motion is this House regrets the invasion of country Y. The opening government team asserts, invading country Y led to a huge increase in terrorism, which will be damaging for the citizens and put them at risk. You have recently read an article on JSTOR that confirms that invading country Y did, in fact, lead to an increase in terrorism. Should you? And the correct answer is C. Evaluate the argument independently, despite knowing it is true. This is for the reason that we don't insert specific knowledge to deduct or add to an argument outside of facts known to a reasonably informed person as defined by manual, which doesn't include in-depth knowledge of articles. Okay, so the second question. The motion is this House regrets the Eurozone. PM makes the claim that strong countries impact the euro price more than weak countries. This is bad because countries want different things. Weak countries need to sell things when strong countries want to buy things and have their money buy more, and so want more expensive euro. Weak countries have crises more and need to print money to help the economy. Strong countries are more stable and don't want to lose value. Weak countries need low prices to win the cheap prices of other countries that have same industries. Strong countries sell more technology and high-level services and don't need to compete on being cheap as much. In the end, weak countries can't make the policies they want. The yellow rebuts this argument by saying the EU is a system of burden sharing to resolving the collective action problem. As a consequence, it grants states the leverage necessary to advocate for their own interest. If disempowered states are able to make their own economic decisions, it shifts the over to middle for political unity in Europe. Moreover, under government's world, the net effects of inflation from proposition lead to an unsustainable economic union, and as such, nothing from proposition is valid. Based on comparing these two claims alone, assuming there were no other significant contributions from either speaker and before deputies delivered their speech, which best describes the current comparison between the teams? The answer is, as of now, opening government is beating opening opposition. And the reasoning for this answer is basically that claims from opposition are largely assertive, and they do not engage with the analysis provided by Prime Minister, which shows negative impacts to weak countries. Neither do they compare why, on balance, the potential contributions from closing opposition should outweigh the harm done by to weaker countries, which is clearly outlined in the comparative through the opening government case. So moving on to question number 3, the motion is this House would ban smoking. As government, PM says, as government, we believe we can ban smoking in a phased model over time. We will first begin by gradually lifting the minimum age to buy cigarettes from 18 years old to 21 years old, and then to 25 years old to 30 years old, before eventually outright banning it for everyone. This will allow current smokers to manage their own addiction over time, and will allow them sufficient notice to go to rehab or try alternative models such as vaping, nicotine patches. We will have strong enforcement over shops selling these cigarettes, and we will impose strong tariffs over time for cigarettes produced or imported into the country. The revenue from these taxes will go towards an extensive education campaigns and street signs to discourage smoking in public places in order to reduce secondhand smoke, as well as a longer-term policy to educate the population about the harms of smoking. Over time, we will have a population that both supports our policy and is able to transition to a smoke-free society. The yellow says government is supposed to ban smoking, not allow everyone above 30 years old to still do it. Therefore, this motion falls, and opening government concedes that it will not be possible to ban smoking completely without resulting in a black market. We made a mistake with this question. The OG model or the Prime Minister text should not have included phasing out completely, but only certain groups. So the part where it says before eventually outright banning it for everyone was not to be included, and this was an omittance which we made, for which we apologize. Which would in this case mean that the leader of the opposition is correct, that the burden of the debate is not met by opening government. The rest of the model is okay and in line with fiat, but if it were the case that PM was only defining the debate to banning smoking to people who are 30 years old or younger, this would not have met the burden of fully banning smoking, despite the phasing out part of the model necessarily could have been okay, but the government still needs to ban the burden of the motion. Therefore, what we have done is just make this question neutral, given that the way in which it was said made it impossible for judges to provide us with the correct answer. And we apologize for that, but still wanted to clarify what was the intention of the question and the rule testing which was supposed to be done. And now moving on to question 4. The motion is this House would prosecute communities for complicity in honor killings. The opening government models the motion in the following way. We would only prosecute these communities where there is some awareness that honor killings occurs in their community. Any members of the community who are unaware will not be prosecuted. This is logically implied by the notion of complicity. Elo argues this is an unreasonable model. This motion implies that the community must always be prosecuted even when they are unaware. The closing argument and closing opposition both agree with the opening opposition's model challenge. Which of the following applies? The correct answer is C. The opening argument ran a reasonable model, and therefore the OG's model should be assumed to be the one used in the vote. OG's model is within the reasonable definition of the debate. It engages with the question of when exactly people are complicit in a fairly analyzed way, which provides us reason to believe this is correct, unlike the opening opposition challenge to the said model. It is important to note also that just because teams challenge a reasonable model from opening argument or potentially disagree with it, agreeing with opening opposition, this doesn't change the fact that if OG provides a reasonable model for the debate, this is the model by which the debate is held according to the rules. Okay, so moving on to the question number 5, which reads, the motion is, this House believes that liberal democracies should constitutionally enshrine the right of regions to unilaterally secede. The opening argument proves that all states ought to have a right to unilaterally secede in principle, and that by allowing for secession, different regions of a country are better able to focus on their own priorities. The closing argument argues when subnational regions aren't given a constitutional right to secede, they will still attempt to pressure the national government into allowing secession. In practice, this means that they engage in violent tactics such as terrorism, as with IRA. This leads to the loss of hundreds of lives and long-term resentment, which prevents reconciliation and cooperation in the future. However, the closing argument did not explain why their material matters more than the opening argument's material. Which of the following best describes the government-bench comparison? We in the end decided to mark two answers correct in the following question. The first one, the closing arguments are well reasoned and impactful. As such, it would be reasonable to place closing argument over opening argument. And the second, number E, none of the above. There needs not to be an exclusive weighing done by closing teams to put them over opening teams. Although this is probably useful for that case and makes for a clearer cut, judges do have the authority to weigh contributions down the bench on their own accord without having explicit weighing made by teams, and they should actively do so. Principled arguments are weighted equally as practicals, unless there is a reason for why teams basically convince us to do otherwise. We accepted number E here as well if judges felt that B's arguments weren't sufficiently persuasive to put closing argument over opening argument, because then the debate would be none of the above. But this doesn't detract from the fact that the rest of the answers basically are wrong for the reasons of putting the unnecessary burden of explicit weighing, or for weighing principled arguments differently, or for putting closing government above opening argument just because it is more interesting, as this is not something which is a metric of comparing contributions. Okay, moving on to question number 6. And question number 6 reads, the motion is, this House would nationalize privately owned houses that are left vacant for more than 6 months. Opening government, opening opposition, and closing government engage in two main practical questions: impacts on social mobility and impacts on investments and real estate bubbles. Closing opposition argues, house owners have a right to their property, and regardless of practical considerations, their rights should not be infringed. Which of the following is most likely to describe closing opposition's position in the law? The correct answer is E. There's not enough information to determine CO's position in debate. It would depend on weighings provided by teams. It is really important that we do not assess principal arguments a priori relative to practical ones in neither of the directions, in prioritizing principle over utilitarian arguments or consequentialist, or the other way around. Rather, the weighing and relevance by teams is the metric to rank teams in this case when there is a different position or different framework from which these arguments were made. So the correct answer is that we would need more information to make this call. Moving on to question number 7, which starts on the motion, this House believes the Catholic Church should allow women to be ordained as priests. Opening government runs the argument that equalizing conditions will lower discrimination towards women and will make women more included into the church. Higher inclusion benefits the Catholic Church as it appears more inclusive and leads to more believers. Closing argument explains why the arguments that opening argument made are more impactful for the developing world, and gives specific examples on how that would affect the communities there. Which of the following is true? The answer is number C. So opening argument provided the mechanisms for the argument, which were then impacted by closing argument in a potentially more important way, but still contingent on opening argument's analysis, meaning opening argument wins. Basically, mechanisms that the impacts are contingent on result in the opening team taking the clash here. Despite the impacting perhaps being clearer in the second halves and the context in which mechanisms are derived perhaps more powerful, in this sort of situation, we result to the mechanisms which made the analysis, which is coming later, contingent on the mechanisms that were provided, and basically without the analysis run by opening argument, there is no any impact manifestation either by opening argument or by closing argument, which means that we resort to opening argument in that case. Moving on to question number 8. In the motion, this House will introduce a flat income tax rate. Opening argument runs an argument on why the most important feature of a tax system is that it is balanced and fair, and successfully proves a flat income tax rate is both of these things. Closing opposition runs an argument that even if a flat income tax is equal for all, indirect taxes, which are collected by the state via sales or excise tax on alcohol or tobacco, disproportionately affect the real income of poor individuals, as they are required to spend a larger portion of their income to afford them. Therefore, taxing people progressively depending on their income is more fair. Opening argument adds the following point of information to closing opposition. Under your tax system, individuals with more wealth are required to pay more money in tax and additionally end up spending more on indirect taxes as they spend more money given their higher income, making this policy less fair. Closing opposition responds to the POI by saying the policy is still less progressive than the alternative. They then proceed to take a second POI in the whip speech from closing argument. Which of the following best describes the long diagonal comparison? The correct answer is D. Opening argument used the POI to engage with closing opposition by pinning their material directly against COs, which should be credited as engagement and wins them the clash. It is important to note that we do not punish teams preemptively or put burdens on how they should have acted regards POIs and preempt material. Aside from what is said in the material that teams should take 1 point of information across the diagonals, which is in this case met. Furthermore, the POI engagement is an important part of the round, and the way in which opening argument pin their material by providing a metric on which to judge the clash on, combining what they already set out to be the most important thing in the debate, combine this with closing opposition's unresponsiveness to this metric change and essentially a weighing between the importance of these effects, tilts the clash to opening argument. Moving on to question number 9. The motion is, this House believes that pursuing strong expansionist policies in the Arctic region is in the Russian interest. Prime Minister says, the Arctic region is resource-rich, with the main emphasis being on high presence of oil sources. Russia has a massive need for oil for its military needs, for the oil-consuming transportation from the far rural areas to the city, and for not becoming reliant on US-produced oil, which will harm its global leverage. ELO responds that Russia is a global oil supplier as it is, with many oil sources of its own, and that in COVID times, oil prices are low anyway. Which of the following statements is correct? The answer is D. ELO is correct, and the globally informed voter should know this, and so the rebuttal stands. A globally informed voter would have seen article headlines both suggesting that Russia is a big global supplier of oil and that in COVID times prices are low. Therefore, this is a fair factual push that can be credited by judges and does not mean that this is something which is specific knowledge for which we don't credit teams or speakers basically claiming. Moving on to question number 10. In the motion, this House would legalize prostitution. Opening opposition says, there are structural reasons to believe that prostitution can lead to human trafficking. In many cases, women are tricked into moving to another country under the guise of other employment or following a boyfriend. Once they retire, they have their passport taken away and are compelled into human trafficking. This happens because women are vulnerable and oftentimes psychologically and emotionally manipulated. The opening opposition has not provided a factual example for the argument. Should you? The correct answer is C. Accept the argument, but it may be less persuasive due to the lack of examples. The argument should not be discounted due to lack of examples. Neither should the speaker be punished. However, examples can and do provide important persuasiveness to arguments, and it is likely that the argument would be more persuasive with them included and a better contribution from this speaker and from this team to the round. With that all in mind, I now want to forward to Jason to answer the following 10 questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Lovro. Okay, great. So question 11 is, the motion is this House as Kim Jong-un would sign a deal with the US to halt nuclear weapon research in exchange for economic and developmental aid. The speaker is in opening opposition. Kim Jong-un is a strong man. This would ruin all domestic political legitimacy he has in North Korea because people would think this as bowing to the USA. Furthermore, as their nuclear weapons are the only leverage for them to be taken seriously in global politics, signing this deal would lead to decreased international standing. Therefore, if Kim Jong-un was to sign the deal, this would be bad for his political legacy, which he cares about because he has failing health problems and because of North Korea's practice of glorifying their past leaders. Closing government rebuts this by saying that economic and developmental aid would be the best thing for North Korea, as the people have lived in poverty for too long and poverty is a net harm. Therefore, Kim Jong-un should help his people access greater material wealth. So, as a quick reminder, this is an actor motion, which is why we're debating from the perspective of Kim Jong-un. With that in mind, the correct answer is B. The reason why the correct answer is B is because in opening opposition, they actually talk about why it's within Kim's interest to maintain his political legitimacy and his political legacy, and then connects it to the debate that's happening. While closing government provides a number of different arguments, they don't end up connecting why it's in the interests of Kim Jong-un. Crucially, though, C is not correct here because even if CG doesn't analyze what Kim's interests are, if opening opposition doesn't either, then they would also end up losing. Question number 12. This House would assassinate Vladimir Putin. So, in this motion, the opening government valiantly argues, Vladimir Putin holds an iron grip over Russia. Any leader but Vladimir Putin would be better, and we prefer it. The longer we let Putin remain, the more he will entrench his power and become irreplaceable. The opening opposition demonstrates that the alternative leaders to Vladimir Putin would definitely be worse and explain why Putin is not such a unique evil. Which best describes the top half comparison? So the big thing that we're trying to test here is whether or not you end up accounting for the difficulty in the motion in your judging. And you never should. You should just be evaluating the clash as it plays out and which team won. Given that, the answer is C. The opening government loses to the opening opposition because the opening opposition does end up proving that proposition, in fact, does not get better leaders, and they in fact prove why Putin isn't a unique evil. If that's the case, then proposition's analysis there doesn't really make a lot of sense because it ends up being rebutted and undermined. Therefore, the opening government loses to the opening opposition. Question 13. The motion is this House would legalize the sale of human organs. The opening government fails to properly define where the motion is taking place. The opening opposition argues that in developing countries, there will typically be more pressure to sell human organs as a consequence of higher poverty rates and is thus unfair. The closing government's rebuttal to the argument is to say that the motion is clearly set in Western liberal democracies if opening government fails to define the motion. Should you? And the answer is A, accept that this debate takes place in both Western liberal democracies and developing countries. In the judge manual, it does explicitly say that we should be assuming that debates happen in functional democracies. Many developing countries and Western liberal democracies are functioning democracies, and therefore they would both fall under the scope of the motion. Any other answer would be too narrow and only focuses on far too small of a set of cases, given the motion itself and the assumption of functional democracies. Question 14. This House would ban zoos. The Prime Minister argues that zoos do not treat their animals well, as they often have to drug animals to be docile in public. It is also traumatizing for animals to be on the receiving end of many strangers, especially with camera flashes and limited living space. This does not provide a true picture of animals to visitors wishing to be educated. LO argues, just because some animals do not treat animals well in the status quo, zoos, do not treat animals well in the status quo, does not mean that this is impossible. In rebuttal, I will show you why all of Gov's harms are circumstantial. They can be regulated away, and animals can be treated in a more humane way. For instance, to ban camera flashes and dedicate more space for animals to have a more natural habitat. We can also outlaw animals from being drugged in zoos, as well as provide more training courses for zookeepers to know how to treat animals properly. Regulation is preferable because it doesn't hurt the economy, but still deals with opening government's concerns. Assuming nothing else of significance happened in either deputy speeches, what best describes the top half of the debate? The answer here is A. Opening opposition beats OG because they rebut why all of OG's case can be modeled away. And in fact, of course, in opening opposition, they have the ability to counterprop and countermodel. Now, the other answers don't end up being as important or as substantial. B is incorrect because opening opposition does have a constructive reason here. They talk about why regulation is preferable and therefore they have a benefit there. In the other sections, I think this is just intuitively incorrect judging, and in the judge manual, it confirms that. So in C, you aren't supposed to be penalized just because you didn't preempt. It's about what teams end up proving by the end of the round. Preemption can be helpful for that, but it isn't strictly necessary. It could be responded to in deputy, although in this case, it was not. D, this one is incorrect just because opening opposition did end up implicitly responding to the idea about educational value because opening government's impacts are tied to the fact that these animals oftentimes are not treated properly and not like they're in their natural habitat. So this already deals with the argument to a certain extent, and the regulation benefits from opening opposition also do exist as well. 15. The motion is this House supports the establishment of a Black secessionary state within the territory of the United States, the founding of which is supported by the American government. Opening government argues, the African American population has been oppressed for generations through the historical practice of slavery and the modern mass incarceration of African Americans. As a consequence, there is an obligation for the US government to provide some form of reparation. We argue that the only sufficient type of reparation is to provide them with the agency they were denied, the political unions ripped away from them, and to provide them a home that they can call their own. Opening government proves this principled argument is the most important argument in the round, and the argument is unrebutted. However, they do not make a set of practical arguments that you think should obviously be in the opening government case. Which of the following applies to opening government's arguments? The correct answer here is C. Opening government's failure to provide practical arguments should not impact them insofar as the persuasiveness of the case is not affected. The reason why this is the answer is because, again, principled arguments are equally as important as practical arguments, and if weighed as the most important thing in the round, they should then take logical precedence over any practical arguments. Just because opening government doesn't run the arguments that you might want them to, you shouldn't punish them. The only real difference is if these arguments would have made their cases genuinely more persuasive, in which case they end up doing better off. But all of the other sorts of answers here are more punitive in nature or ends up misevaluating practical versus principled arguments. Therefore, the answer here is C. 16. On the motion, this House regrets the rise of teenagers at the forefront of social movements, e.g. Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai. Opening government's case is that this motion has led to an increase in participation and interest from young people, which is beneficial because it increases the size and scope of protests and social movements. OO argues that this does not matter, as the youth cannot vote, and therefore it is hard for them to make a change despite having large protests, and that instead removes legitimacy from social movements and makes it easier for politicians to ridicule them and take them less seriously. Additionally, OO argues it is bad for teenagers who then have to deal with a lot of online harassment. The CG extension speaker says, firstly, the opposition is wrong by saying that youth protests do not matter. Despite them being unable to vote, protests are disruptive to the government and to current voters, which means that the government cares about solving protest issues. Additionally, governments understand that the youth will be voting in a couple of years and that it is important to make them happy if they want to win the next election. Therefore, the larger the protest, the more successful it is likely to be. Youth leaders like Greta are extremely important because young people are usually told to leave things to the adults, and seeing someone like them encourages them to raise their voice and protest. Which of the following best describes the Gov bench in the debate? And the answer here is C. What we're testing for is what an extension is. And in this case, opening government's arguments were all undermined and they were not proven by the end of the top half. Closing government's responses constitute unique analysis because it ends up proving what the opening government is trying to prove when they couldn't, and therefore it is a legitimate extension because it does add on unique analysis, which contributes to the opening government material. In general, rebuttal can count as an extension, so long as it does substantively add to the case, and what we're trying to evaluate here is where the contributions are and how large these contributions are. Now, the other answers are incorrect just because obviously B, if you don't respond but you outweigh, you can still end up winning the debate. And then A and D both misunderstand how extensions work in this case, particularly given the fact that opening government was losing to opening opposition beforehand. Question 17. On the motion, this House opposes the use of shaming as a practice by activists. OG argues that shaming causes people who behave badly to disengage from the argument or become defensive. This means that it is hard to constructively change their behavior and will only escalate the argument even more when both sides are unwilling to concede. Therefore, shaming is not a useful practice to create social change and should not be used by activists. CO argues, opening government have only opposed instances when shaming is done badly by activists, but not when shaming is done well and with the best of intentions. On our side, we do not have to support all instances of shaming, but can pick the best ones that we choose to support. On Gov's side, their burden is to show why they oppose all instances of shaming by activists. Which of the following best describes what happens in the OG closing opposition clash? The crucial theme here that we're trying to measure or trying to test is the idea of creating explicit burdens. And here, the burden that closing opposition imposes is unreasonable. They can't just show that some instances are, or the best instances do apply, because that ends up basically unfairly placing the burden on Gov. On proposition, if they can demonstrate that the number of bad cases or the impact of the bad cases is greater than that of the good cases, then they can still end up winning, which means that B and C are correct, because although OG's argument doesn't apply to all cases, there's still some cases where the arguments may apply, and then you'll have to weigh it. And then for C, closing opposition doesn't show how good shaming happens either, and therefore they also suffer from the same problems of lack of characterization as opening government does. Now, the issue is not that closing opposition is too late adding new burdens, it's just that the burden is inaccurate. And again, that's also why opening government hasn't failed their burden, because that burden was inaccurate. Question 18. This House would prohibit cities from offering tax credits and other incentives to attract large companies. Opening opposition. Cities have the autonomy to do what they want with their budget to better the lives of their people. Tax credits and other financial incentives do this as they attract large companies to set up base in a particular city, which allows the city to gain an edge over other cities in the region for companies looking to locate in a city with already good business linkages. This in turn attracts even more companies to come here, increasing employment. Large companies can provide good paying jobs and innovative skills that help to further the city's economic livelihood. Closing opposition. This debate agrees that cities are able to do this, but the question is whether they should. We will show you why tax credits are the best way to improve the economic viability of a city. Large companies bring a whole range of operations to a city, which help increase jobs available because they hire people directly and because they generate more business for other medium and small companies. This also creates economies of scale by turning the city into a burgeoning business hub. Going only by what was said above, which of the following best describes CO's position in the debate? The answer here is A. The analysis does end up adding quite a bit, particularly in terms of the idea of jobs available and economies of scale. This ends up demonstrating that there is an extension because there's new analysis. However, this impact of that new analysis has to be weighed against the analysis that came out from opening opposition as well. And without that, it does seem like open opposition has done enough of the work such that they would end up beating CO if there is no weighing done. And B, that's incorrect because there is no weighing, and therefore we can't assess how important this is. And C is incorrect. Just because you're trying to achieve the same impact doesn't mean that you're completely derivative. It just might mean that your contribution doesn't prove as much in comparison to opening, and thus is weighed as less important. Question 19. The motion is this House regrets the glorification of hard work. Opening government argues that the glorification of hard work leads to people overworking themselves, leading to substantial harm to the mental health of everyone who does overwork themselves. The MO fails to respond to the argument, but instead argues, the glorification of hard work does not lead to more people engaging in hard work. There are other stronger incentives to work hard, such as gaining economic upliftment or social status. Thus, the only difference in this debate is that those who push themselves to work hard feel more celebrated and respected, leading to them feeling better about themselves. Which of these factors is relevant for determining who wins the lawn diagonal? The answers are from B to E. A is incorrect because even though CO fails to respond, there are two counter-asserted characterizations, and we have to decide which characterization is more correct on the strength of their analysis, which is basically B. C, D, and E are all relevant, so C is about failing to take a POI. We've already answered this before. It does factor in. D, we do need to consider material that implicitly clashes to determine that clash and ensure we're not discrediting or discounting OG too much. Then E, weighing is very useful. Now, F is a little bit weird here because it doesn't affect the explicit comparison on the op bench, and therefore it shouldn't be taken into account for the same reasons as noted before. Finally, the motion is this House, as the GOP, would rerun Trump for election in 2024. Elo makes the case that the alternative should be someone more moderate. They then go on and provide multiple mechanisms for why swing voters are more likely to vote for a moderate Republican than Trump. DPM claims that Trump is good exactly because he's radical and far from the establishment. They then explain why someone like that is more likely to mobilize voters than someone moderate. DLO responds that they co-opt those metrics too, as under their side, they can also run someone even more radical than Trump and win on OG's metric. Which of the following best describes the DLO's contribution? The answer here is B. The LO first says the alternative is someone more moderate and bases their full case on it. Then the DLO just contradicts it, which means that you should discredit the second contradicting statement. This is just standard BP rules. You need to account for the knives and the contradictions that do happen. Fantastic. That is the judge test. If you have any questions, please do let us know. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today, and we hope that you have a lovely time judging at Euros. Thank you.